A sky blazing with fire over a disputed border. 6 enemy fighter jets falling like dying stars into the night. In the cockpit of an F-22, the calm face of an unfamiliar woman, eyes focused, hands steady, every movement precise and coldly calculated. But here's the most shocking part. Nobody at the base realized she was a pilot until everything was over. Hey, where in the world are you watching this video from? What would be your first emotion if you found yourself in this situation? Share your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe to continue this incredible journey with us. Kara Mitchell stood in the shadow of the hangar, her 26-year-old frame almost invisible among the towering F-22 Raptors. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, revealing a face marked by desert sun and years of unspoken disappointments. The flight suit she wore was standard issue, but notably absent were the patches, ribbons, and insignia that decorated every other uniform on the base. To everyone at Nellis Air Force Base, she was just another technical assistant. The coffee fetcher, the wire checker, the woman who appeared each morning with a clipboard and disappeared into the background noise of military routine. "Hey, Mitchell," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called out with casual cruelty. "The colonel's coffee is getting cold. Maybe focus on what you're actually qualified for instead of staring at jets you'll never fly." Laughter rippled through the group of Navy and Air Force pilots gathered around the mission briefing board. These men wore their credentials like armor. Top Gun patches, combat ribbons, call signs earned through blood and skill. To them, Kara represented everything they'd worked to prove they weren't. Grounded, relegated, forgotten. "She's not even cleared to taxi one of these birds, let alone take it up," Lieutenant Commander Hayes added, his voice carrying the particular brand of dismissal reserved for those deemed unworthy. "Just here to make sure our coffee stays hot and our pre-flight checklists get filed properly." Kara said nothing. She never said anything. Just nodded, made note of whatever mundane task they'd assigned her, and moved on to the next humiliation. But her eyes told a different story. They tracked the aircraft with the intensity of a hunter, memorizing every line, every system, every deadly capability. The other personnel had created an entire mythology around her silence. Some whispered she was a washout from pilot training, broken by the pressure and relegated to support duties. Others suggested she was politically connected, someone's daughter or niece who needed a safe military job away from real danger. None of them knew the truth. None of them understood that Kara Mitchell had once been someone else entirely. Late at night, when the base settled into its routine quiet, Kara would walk the flight line alone. She'd run her fingers along the composite skin of the F-22s, feeling the subtle vibrations that spoke of power held in check. These machines had once been extensions of her will, responsive to her touch like living creatures bred for war. The hardest moments came during the pre-dawn hours when the tactical squadrons launched for training missions. Kara would find excuses to be outside, clipboard in hand, watching dozens of millions of dollars worth of American air power thunder into the sky. The sound hit her like a physical blow, not of pain, but of longing so intense it made her chest tight. She'd built her life around staying invisible, keeping her head down, surviving on the margins of a world that had once welcomed her as family. Because invisibility meant safety. Invisibility meant no one asked questions about her past, about the missions that officially never happened, about the records that had been systematically erased from every database that mattered. But the sky called to her every single day. It whispered in the language of thrust vectors and weapon systems, spoken frequencies only pilots understood. Some nights, she'd dream she was back in the cockpit, pulling Gs that crushed normal people, dancing with death at 40,000 feet, while enemy missiles painted trails across her 6 o'clock. Then she'd wake up to another day of coffee runs and equipment checks, another day of pretending she belonged in the shadows when everything in her DNA screamed for altitude. The cruelest irony was that she worked daily with machines she understood better than the men who flew them. Every system, every capability, every tactical advantage, all of it was burned into her memory from years of training that technically never existed. She could have taught courses on air-to-air combat, but instead she organized filing cabinets and updated maintenance schedules. They'd buried Kara Mitchell's name, but they couldn't bury the pilot who lived inside her skin. Every evening at 1900 hours, Kara performed the same ritual. She'd finish her assigned duties, file the last reports, and walk out to the edge of the runway, where the red lights marked the boundary between Earth and sky. There, in the growing darkness, she'd watch the night training flights prepare for departure. The sound began as a whisper, auxiliary power units spinning up, fuel pumps pressurizing, navigation systems initializing. Then came the deeper rumble as main engines fired, transforming millions of dollars of technology into something alive and hungry for flight. The takeoffs were thunder made visible, afterburners painting blue-white signatures across the desert darkness. Kara would stand there until the last navigation light disappeared into the starfield, her hands unconsciously moving through muscle memory sequences that had once controlled similar machines. Her fingers would trace invisible weapon selections, calculate intercept vectors, adjust for atmospheric conditions that existed only in her mind. The internal war never stopped. Part of her, the part that had learned to survive in the shadows, whispered that safety lay in invisibility. Keep quiet, stay hidden, accept the coffee runs and the condescending smiles because exposure meant questions. And questions led to investigations that could destroy what little life she'd managed to build. But there was another voice, deeper and more persistent, that spoke in the language of thrust and lift and the peculiar mathematics of aerial combat. This voice reminded her of who she'd been before politics and classified mishaps had erased her from the official record. It whispered about responsibility, about capabilities unused while lesser pilots flew missions she could execute in her sleep. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November, when she witnessed something that made her stomach clench with professional frustration. A training exercise had gone sideways, not dangerously, but badly enough that two F-22s had limped home with systems failures that could have been avoided with better tactical awareness. Kara had watched the debriefing through a hangar window, seen the pilots shrug off near misses that would have been catastrophic in real combat. Their casual attitude towards survival made her hands shake with suppressed anger. These men treated their aircraft like expensive toys, never understanding that air superiority was earned through precision, discipline, and the kind of situational awareness that kept you alive when the enemy was trying very hard to kill you. That night, she broke protocol. Instead of walking the perimeter, she used her maintenance access codes to enter Hangar 7, where a lone F-22 sat under security lighting like a sleeping predator. The Raptor was beautiful in the way that only purpose-built weapons could be. Every angle calculated for stealth, every surface designed to deliver death with surgical precision. Kara circled the aircraft slowly, her trained eye catching details that most people missed. The slight scoring on the engine, intakes that spoke of high-altitude operations. The nearly invisible panels that concealed sensors worth more than most people's houses. The weapon bay doors that could open and close in milliseconds, transforming the sleek fighter into an instrument of devastation. She stopped at the cockpit and looked up at the ejection seat where she'd once spent hundreds of hours, hands moving across controls that responded to her touch, like extensions of her nervous system. The heads-up display, the multi-function panels, the stick and throttle that translated pilot intention into machine performance, all of it was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "They erased my name from the sky," she whispered into the hangar's darkness. "But they can't erase the sky from me." The words hung in the air like a promise or a threat, depending on perspective. Because Kara Mitchell knew something that none of the smirking pilots suspected. She was better than all of them. Not because of ego or delusion, but because of training so intensive and classification so high that it existed in governmental shadows most people never imagined. She'd been part of something called the Silent Eagles, a program so classified that its existence was denied by officials who'd helped create it. The finest pilots in American military history, trained to operate beyond normal parameters, to execute missions that required capabilities bordering on the impossible. The program had ended badly, not through failure, but through politics and the kind of bureaucratic cowardice that sacrificed effectiveness for deniability. One mission had gone public when it should have stayed buried, and suddenly everyone involved became a liability. Records disappeared, pilots were reassigned or quietly discharged. The Silent Eagles were erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. But you can't erase capability. You can't delete years of training that push human reaction times beyond normal limits. You can't remove the kind of spatial awareness that lets a pilot track multiple bogies while managing complex weapon systems in high-G environments. As Kara walked back across the darkened base, she made a decision that had been building for months. She was tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be less than she was, tired of watching inferior pilots risk their lives and their aircraft through ignorance and overconfidence. If the opportunity ever arose, if the situation ever demanded capabilities that only she possessed, Kara Mitchell would step out of the shadows and remind everyone exactly what a Silent Eagle could do. She had no idea that opportunity was less than 72 hours away. The alarm began as a low, pulsing tone that made everyone on base stop what they were doing. Within seconds, it escalated to the full-throated shriek of a conditioned red alert. Incoming hostile aircraft. All personnel to battle stations. Kara was in the communications center, updating flight schedules. When the first radar contacts appeared on the main tactical display, 6 aircraft flying in formation had crossed into restricted airspace without authorization or identification. Their flight profiles suggested military jets, and their heading put them on a direct course for the base. "Where's Alpha Squadron?" Colonel Morrison's voice cracked with tension as he surveyed the tactical situation. The main fighter wing was 300 miles away on a training exercise, and the backup squadrons were grounded for maintenance issues that had seemed routine an hour ago. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Sir, I can take up Raptor 7. I've got maybe 200 hours in type, but 200 hours?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Son, those contacts are flying like they know what they're doing. You'd be dead before you got a lock." The radar operator's voice cut through the discussion. 6 minutes to weapons range, Colonel. If they're hostile and armed with long-range missiles, we need to get something in the air now, or we're going to be fighting from the ground." Kara looked at the tactical display and felt something cold and familiar settle in her stomach. The enemy formation was textbook. 2 lead aircraft drawing attention, while 4 others maintained positions for mutual support in overlapping fire zones. These weren't amateur pilots playing games. This was a coordinated strike package flown by professionals who intended to destroy everything on the ground. "Sir," her voice was quiet, but it carried across the communication center like a blade. "Fuel Raptor 3. I'll take her up." The silence that followed was complete. Every person in the room turned to stare at the technical assistant who just volunteered to single-handedly engage 6 enemy fighters. Hayes recovered first, his voice dripping with contempt. You're not even authorized to start the engines, let alone—" "There's no time for authorization debates," Kara said, moving toward the door with mechanical precision. 6 fighters, 1 defender. Those are better odds than I've faced before. Colonel Morrison grabbed her arm as she passed. "Mitchell, I don't know what kind of death wish you're nursing, but I'm not sending a maintenance tech up against military pilots." Kara met his eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, she let him see exactly who she was. The mask of quiet subservience fell away, replaced by something that made the colonel unconsciously step back. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the absolute confidence of someone who'd faced death at 40,000 feet and walked away. "With respect, you don't have any other options, and I'm not a maintenance tech." Something in her tone made Morrison release her arm. Maybe it was the way she moved, not like someone asking permission, but like someone stating facts. Maybe it was the complete absence of fear in her voice when everyone else was fighting panic. "What are you?" Morrison asked. "Someone who can fly." Kara was already moving toward the hangar. "Someone who can fight. Someone who can win." The next 10 minutes blurred together in controlled chaos. Kara climbed into Raptor 3 while ground crews scrambled to fuel and arm the aircraft. Her hands moved across pre-flight sequences with the automaticity of muscle memory, systems coming online under her touch like old friends recognizing a familiar voice. The cockpit felt like coming home. Every display, every control, every subtle vibration of the airframe spoke to her in the language she'd been born to understand. The heads-up display painted targeting information across her vision while the radar began its hunt for enemy signatures. "Mitchell, this is Tower. You are not cleared for takeoff. Repeat, you are not authorized for—" Kara switched frequencies, cutting through the bureaucratic noise to reach the tactical channel. Tower, Ghost 1 is rolling hot. 6 bandits inbound. Time to intercept 4 minutes. Either clear me for immediate takeoff or explain to Congress why you let an enemy strike package destroy $1 billion worth of American aircraft. The runway lights shifted to green. Sometimes survival instincts overcome regulations. Raptor 3 lifted off into a sky painted orange by desert sunset, afterburners carving blue fire across the horizon. Kara felt the familiar weight of G-forces as she climbed, the aircraft responding to her touch like a living creature bred for war. The enemy formation appeared on her radar at 30 miles. 6 contacts maintaining formation discipline as they approached what they believed would be an undefended target. They had no way of knowing that their carefully planned strike was about to encounter something outside their calculations. A silent eagle with nothing left to lose. Kara selected her first target, the lead aircraft, flying point for the formation. At 20 miles, she achieved missile lock and fired 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs, advanced beyond visual range weapons that could kill at distances the enemy wouldn't expect. The first kill came 12 seconds later. A brilliant flash on the horizon marked the destruction of the lead fighter, its pilot never knowing what had hit him. The enemy formation scattered, professional discipline giving way to survival instincts as they realized they weren't attacking a defenseless base but engaging a fighter pilot who knew exactly what she was doing. For Kara, the next 18 minutes became a deadly dance at the edge of physics and human endurance. She moved through the sky like a ghost made of thunder, appearing on enemy radar just long enough to kill before disappearing into electronic invisibility. 6 contacts became 5, 5 became 3, 3 became 1. When the last enemy fighter fell burning toward the desert floor, Kara Mitchell allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Then she turned toward home, where a base full of people was about to learn exactly who they'd been serving coffee to for the past 2 years. The F-22 touched down on runway 17 with the gentle precision of a feather settling on still water. As Kara taxied toward the hangar, she could see the entire base personnel lined up along the flight line. Pilots, ground crews, officers, enlisted personnel. Everyone who had been on duty during what would later be called the 15-minute war stood waiting in absolute silence. When the engines spun down and the canopy opened, Kara climbed out of the cockpit with oil stains on her flight suit and sweat marking her face where the oxygen mask had pressed against her skin. Her legs were shaky from the adrenaline crash, but her hands were steady as she removed her helmet and faced the crowd that had gathered to witness her return. Colonel Morrison was the first to approach, his expression unreadable. Behind him walked Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and a dozen other pilots who had spent 2 years treating her like an inconvenient piece of furniture. 6 confirmed kills, Morrison said, his voice carrying across the silent flight line. 18 minutes from wheels up to wheels down. 0 friendly casualties, 0 collateral damage. He paused, studying Kara's face like he was seeing her for the first time. Mitchell, I need to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Who the hell are you? Kara straightened, feeling 2 years of careful invisibility falling away like shed skin. Someone who should never have been forgotten, sir. Before Morrison could respond, his aide approached with a tablet displaying classified information that had taken emergency clearances to access. The colonel read for several minutes, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something approaching awe. Jesus Christ, he whispered. You're a silent eagle. The whisper rippled through the assembled crowd like wildfire. Most of them had heard rumors about the Silent Eagles. Ghost pilots who flew missions that officially never happened, engaging targets that were never confirmed destroyed. They were legend, myth, the kind of stories shared in late-night conversations between pilots who weren't entirely sure they believed what they were hearing. But legends weren't supposed to serve coffee in military hangars. The program was discontinued, Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as he processed the implications. All personnel were reassigned or discharged. Records were classified beyond normal access levels. Some of us fell through the cracks, Kara replied simply. The bureaucrats who shut down the program weren't particularly concerned about what happened to the pilots afterward. As long as we stayed quiet and didn't embarrass anyone, they were content to let us disappear. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped forward, the same man who had mocked her qualifications less than an hour earlier. His face was pale, but his voice carried genuine respect. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. Kara studied his face, then looked at the assembled crowd of military personnel who had treated her like a servant for 2 years. She could have delivered a speech about respect and recognition, could have used this moment to humiliate those who had humiliated her. Instead, she simply nodded. Apology accepted, Commander. You couldn't have known. But Colonel Morrison wasn't finished processing the situation. Mitchell, or should I say Captain Mitchell, why didn't you tell us? Why endure 2 years of being treated like support personnel when you had these capabilities? Kara's smile was slight but genuine. Because sometimes the best place to observe a situation is from the shadows, sir. And because I wasn't sure I wanted to be a pilot again until about an hour ago. She gestured toward the F-22 behind her, its airframe still radiating heat from combat operations. But some things you never really stop being, even when everyone pretends you never existed in the first place. The crowd began to disperse, but the conversations would continue long into the night. By morning, every person on base would know the story of the technical assistant who had single-handedly engaged 6 enemy fighters and emerged victorious. Within a week, word would spread throughout the military aviation community. The Silent Eagle had returned to the sky, and this time, nobody would forget her name. 3 weeks after what military historians would later call the Nellis incident, Kara Mitchell found herself standing in the same spot where she'd once watched training flights with the desperate longing of someone permanently grounded. But everything had changed. The story had leaked, despite classification attempts and official denials. Military blogs picked up fragments of the tale, a female pilot emerging from nowhere to defend an American airbase against overwhelming odds. Social media amplified the whispers until they became a roar that no amount of bureaucratic damage control could silence. Video footage from base security cameras had somehow found its way to news networks, showing the moment when a woman in a standard flight suit climbed into an F-22 and took off to face impossible odds. The landing footage was even more dramatic. Kara emerging from the cockpit, oil-stained and exhausted, while an entire military base stood in stunned silence. Within days, she'd become a symbol. Young women in military academies printed her picture and posted it in their dormitories. Female pilots around the world shared the story as proof that excellence couldn't be hidden forever. The hashtag #Silent Eagle trended globally for a week. But for Kara, the most meaningful changes were quieter and more personal. She stood on the flight line at sunset, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. Behind her, 3 other pilots approached, real pilots, with real respect in their voices when they asked for her tactical opinions. Tomorrow morning, she would brief a squadron on air-to-air combat techniques that had been developed in programs so classified they technically didn't exist. Captain Mitchell? The voice belonged to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a recent Air Force Academy graduate who had requested transfer to Nellis specifically to serve under Kara's command. The evening briefing is ready when you are. Captain, the rank had been restored along with her official pilot status, backdated to account for the years she'd spent in bureaucratic limbo. More importantly, she'd been offered command of a new tactical development squadron, a unit tasked with developing combat techniques for situations where conventional doctrine wasn't enough. Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll be there in a moment. Chen nodded and headed back toward the briefing room, where a dozen of America's finest pilots waited to learn from someone who had once been dismissed as a coffee fetcher. The irony wasn't lost on Kara, but she'd learned that dwelling on past injustices was less productive than focusing on future opportunities. The real validation hadn't come from media attention or restored rank. It had come 3 days after the incident, when Colonel Morrison had approached her with a classified folder containing details about emerging threats that required exactly the kind of capabilities she possessed. "We need pilots who can think beyond conventional parameters," he'd explained. "Pilots who can engage superior numbers and win through skill rather than technology. Pilots who understand that the best weapon system is useless without the right person controlling it." The mission profiles were challenging, the kind of scenarios where textbook tactics would get you killed and only creative adaptation would ensure survival. They were the reason programs like the Silent Eagles had been created in the first place, and the reason they would be needed again as global conflicts evolved beyond traditional boundaries. Kara looked up at the star field beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, other pilots were flying missions that would never appear in official records, engaging threats that posed existential challenges to American interests. Some of those pilots were probably former Silent Eagles like herself, pulled back from obscurity because their skills had become critical again. The night training flights were beginning their departure sequence, engines spooling up for another round of exercises that would prepare young pilots for realities they couldn't yet imagine. But this time, Kara wouldn't be watching from the sidelines. Tomorrow she would be leading them. The desert wind carried the sound of jet engines across the base, a mechanical symphony that spoke of power and precision and the peculiar marriage of human skill with advanced technology. For the first time in 2 years, Kara Mitchell felt like she was exactly where she belonged. She turned and walked toward the briefing room, where the next generation of combat pilots waited to learn from someone who had been forgotten but never truly defeated. The Silent Eagle was flying again, and this time, the sky would remember her name. There you have it, the incredible true story of Captain Kara Mitchell, the woman who went from serving coffee to commanding respect in the deadliest 20 minutes of her career. Her journey reminds us that true capability can't be hidden forever, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is someone nobody sees coming. If this story inspired you, if it made you think about the hidden potential in people around you, drop a comment with the word respect below. Share this with someone who needs to know that being underestimated can be the ultimate advantage. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button right now, because we're just getting started with these untold stories of courage and determination. Next week, we're diving into another classified tale that will change how you think about what's possible when everything is on the line. Until then, remember Captain Mitchell's lesson. Never let anyone else define your ceiling. The sky belongs to those bold enough to claim it.